I will be discussing in the next 3 sessions detailed parts of this precious book, The Priceless Pearl. For this first session, we're going to talk about its author, Amatu'l-Bahá Rúḥíyyih Khánum. She once said that when she died, she had 3 questions to ask God. One question was a better understanding of the difference between fate and predestination. Of course, none of us knows what our destiny will be. Mary Maxwell, exceptionally raised by her beloved mother and entirely devoted to her guardian, may not have known her destiny, that it would become the wife and suffer the widowhood of the guardian. Perhaps she knew that part of her destiny was to be a writer. When the local spiritual assembly of Montreal signed its incorporation papers, among the 9 names there was the signature of William Sutherland Maxwell, architect, May Maxwell, housewife, and Mary Maxwell, writer. For brevity's sake, let's just look at her writings after becoming the wife of Shoghi Effendi on March the 24th, 1937, and in keeping with our subject. When reading The Priceless Pearl, Rúḥíyyih Khánum's brilliant biography of the life of the guardian, you can't help but notice how much of her life is being shared. Her significance writings include the Bahá'í World Volume XI, pages 113 to 126. She wrote an article called The 25th Anniversary of the Guardianship. From those 13 pages, I always remember reading this, speaking on the early days of the guardian of the faith of God. This is her writing. We, on our part, beheld a young man of only 24 standing at the helm of the cause, and some of the friends felt impelled to advise him about what it would be wise for him to do next. It was then that we began to know not only the nature of our first guardian, but the nature of the entire institution of the guardianship. For we quickly discovered that Shoghi Effendi was unreachable. Neither relatives, old Baha'is or new Baha'is, well-wishers or ill-wishers, could sway his judgment or influence his decisions. We quickly came to realize that he was not only divinely guided, but had been endowed by God with just those characteristics needed to build up the administrative order, unite the believers in common endeavors, and coordinate their worldwide activities. All of these will be covered for you in The Priceless Pearl. The guardian passed away in London on November the 4th, 1957, and was buried on November the 9th, 1957. You will read all that she did during those 5 days in London while still suffering from the shock of the loss of Shoghi Effendi. Her first thoughts was the shock of the believers around the world. Exactly 1 month later, we have a 24-page report, The Passing of Shoghi Effendi, written by Rúḥíyyih Khánum and published by the British Publishing Trust. At least the copy I have, which I copied from a book on one of my teaching trips to London. The article is dated December the 9th, 1 month from the guardian's burial. And she wrote it in Haifa. Just like her concern for the brokenhearted believers paying their respects to their guardian at his graveside, she thought how helpful it would be for their hearts to know what Shoghi Effendi's final days were and the burden of his work leading to their loss. I remember David Hoffman, one of the original members of the Universal House of Justice, saying that if for no other reason would he love Rúḥíyyih Khánum, it was how she comforted the weeping believers as they each passed by the guardian's casket. But what weighed on her own broken heart? What was she doing between November the 9th and December the 9th? Writing that 20-page article, The Passing of Shoghi Effendi? Think about it. The worldwide believers had received an unexpected blow. I think Rúḥíyyih Khánum possessed an innate ability to sense when extreme occasions demanded action, and without thinking of herself, acted with an openness of sharing their sorrow. But there was something else going on during that mentioned month. Rúḥíyyih Khánum was probably the one most aware that the faith had no physical leader. The believers must be wondering what was going to happen to the cause. What would become of the work of the guardian for which he gave his life? So she gathered the hands of the cause of God, chosen by the guardian for the protection and propagation of the faith, to the Holy Land for the initial conclave as custodians of the cause of God. That first conclave was held for 8 days during that month, 18 to the 25th of November. Repeating the sequence of that 1 month and 5 days. November the 4th, 1957, Shoghi Effendi dies. November the 9th, he is buried after a few days of Rúḥíyyih Khánum's planning and executing the arrangements. November the 18th to the 25th, she is leading the first conclave of the Hands of the Cause. December the 9th, The Passing of Shoghi Effendi is published, which she had to have written during that month following the funeral of the guardian. So much more was going on that we can't cover in this session. For example, the very evening of the guardian's passing, November 4, Rúḥíyyih Khánum telephoned the news to another hand in Haifa, Leroy Iowas. In that historic conversation, they made decisions for the protection of the holy places, the guardian's apartment where all his records were kept, and the faith from attack by the enemies of the faith. You can read how those decisions were put into action in the first statement in the Ministry of the Custodians, 1957 to 1963, which follows a 22-page introduction written by Amatu'l-Bahá Rúḥíyyih Khánum. In our last Zoom session on the Kitabi Akdas, I recommended the reading of the Ministry of the Custodians. I do so again now. Jumping to 1963, the Custodians, as the Universal House of Justice said in its first ever message delivered at the World Congress in London, had kept the ship on its course and brought it safe to port. The latest faith of God now had a leader, as ordained in the revelation of Baha'u'llah and the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, the Universal House of Justice. So much history, again, has to be set aside to stay on our theme. Among the plethora of tasks that the newly formed Universal House of Justice had to do was produce the next Bahá'í World Volume. It would have to pick up from the last one and carry it forward to the present year, 1954 to 1963. That period would include the passing of the guardian. Naturally, the House of Justice turned to the guardian's consort and helpmate, his shield and his loving wife, to write the immemorial for that Baha'i world. Being the epitome of instant, exact, and complete obedience, Rúḥíyyih Khánum did not hesitate to comply to the request, and the writer began writing. The article became rather lengthy. She met with the House of Justice to tell them. They replied, "Keep writing." It continued to grow in length. She went back to the House. They told her the same thing. Keep writing. The result was The Guardian of the Baha'i Faith by Amatu'l-Bahá, Rúḥíyyih Khánum. 147 pages in volume 13 of the Baha'i World. Following that gem from the heart of its author in that volume is also reproduced The Passing of Shoghi Effendi, which she wrote that critical month in 1957 mentioned above. Readings for the guardian's funeral are not in the volume 13, but it is in other books. This is mentioned, these writings at the guardian's funeral, because there were 7 readers at the service and 2 at the graveside. I found it touching that one of those 2 was a prayer written by Shoghi Effendi and chanted in Persian. 147 pages on the life of the beloved guardian for the latest Baha'i World. That wasn't Shoghi Effendi's entire life. There was much more to tell the believers who so loved him and arose to do what he asked of them. So much had to be told of his stupendous work, raising up the administrative order, translating and producing books on the revelation of Baha'u'llah and the history of the faith, tens of thousands of messages to individuals and institutions, developing the World Center, protecting the holy places, his sufferings and sacrifices, and so much more. The friends and history needed to know it all. Thus was born the Priceless Pearl, built upon those 147 pages in the volume 13 of Baha'i World. Now, I was not around during much of the 4 years that Amatu'l-Bahá Rúḥíyyih Khánum was writing the Priceless Pearl, arriving to serve the World Center in the fall of 1968. But of course, I learned of that period from the ladies who were in her company. Ethel Ravel, Violet Nachivani, wife of the House member Ali Nachivani, and my dear longtime friend, Nell Golden. There is much to share of these 3 ladies, but we'll save it for another time. I will not attempt to speak on the unique relationship of Rúḥíyyih Khánum and the Guardian, only to say that recalling and reliving his life had its effect on her sorrowing heart. There were times I was told that she would just get up and leave the room while working with the ladies on the book. To put this detailed biography of our guardian into our hands cost her dearly. I might dare to say that Rúḥíyyih Khánum may have had to put aside her feelings because of all that was expected of her as a hand of the cause of God for the 40+ years after the guardian's passing. But she was always aware of his absence. A personal story. One day, I had to leave something at the master's house. The system was you walked in the back door down a hall which led you into the reception room, in the middle of which was a round table, and you would leave things there. As I was approaching the table, RúḥíyyyiH Khánum came out of the door on the left side, which led to her private quarters upstairs. She saw me, ran across the reception room, and threw her arms around me in much emotion. I was so worried that something bad had happened, but she looked at me and said, Marianne, Marianne, I dreamt of the Guardian last night. Having finished the Priceless Pearl, what followed? Well, let's back up a bit. The very thought of his death always upset RúḥíyyyiH Khánum. But one time he told her that when he died, she should travel. Of course, she always said, oh no, Shoghi Effendi, you will not go before me. No, in case it happens, you must travel. There isn't a moment of her guardian's life that she would ever forget, certainly not that moment. A few years after the establishment of the Universal House of Justice, she made a plan to travel teach, with Violette as her traveling companion. I well remember her gathering all the friends serving at the World Center to the master's house. We all fit into what is known as the Mandar room. She wanted to speak to us before taking off for Africa for 1 year. Little did she know that she would be away from the World Center for almost 4 years. Another reading recommendation is Violette's detailed record of that trip in the book, The Great African Safari. Before leaving Haifa in July of 1969, RúḥíyyyiH Khánum left the proofing of The Priceless Pearl with Nell in charge and me as a helper. For 9 months, after hours of our House of Justice daily work and our 1 day off a week, we proofed both the galley sheets and the page proofs. Nell read out loud from the manuscript. I looked silently at the galleys to catch typos and such. Nell, of course, had been privy to the entire book and knew how I would be affected when we got to the part of Shoghi Effendi's passing. She read all the chapters, all the pages in that chapter without stopping. And I looked at the galley sheets, oblivious of any errors. The heart was heavy and the tears fell. Not a word was said between us when she finished the chapter. She just began reading it all again. I might interject that years later, there would be a similar experience when reading the article in the summer 1994 issue of World Order magazine, Medical Aspects of the Sufferings of Baha'u'llah. Dr. Thomas Buckingham takes the reader into the Sia Shah for an understanding of what Baha'u'llah was subjected to in the 4 months in the Black Pit of Tehran. When recommending the reading of that article, I advised being alone. Who would not be moved and have the heart affected when learning of the horrors endured by Baha'u'llah and the sadness of Shoghi Effendi's passing on his beloved wife's heart? However, lest you now think that this speaker is a sensitive soul to be emulated, the following personal story in respect of the Priceless Pearl will alter such a belief. In the summer of 1970, Nell and I took our holidays from the World Center. We flew to New York and then separated, she to South Carolina and me to Peru. While we were away from Haifa, 9 copies of the deluxe edition of the Priceless Pearl were sent to the World Center. That limited edition of, I believe, 2,000 copies had a red hardback cover, and they were each signed by Rúḥíyyih Khánum. Undoubtedly, the 9 were for the Universal House of Justice members. I'm not positive about this, just surmising. However, what occurred was that a staff member was asked to put everyone's name in a hat, and 9 names were pulled out to receive the copies. I learned of this upon returning to Haifa from holiday. What I also learned was that because Nell and I were not there, our names were not in the hat. You really don't want to see me when my anger is aroused. I knew that Nell would get a deluxe edition copy and one of the first signed, a low number. I knew that I wouldn't. After all, Rúḥíyyih Khánum knew me less than a year before she went to Africa. And she didn't know all those evenings and Saturdays that Nell and I were working on the proofreading. Anyway, I let it be known to the collector of names for the hat how I felt. Now, for some reason, 2 more copies of the deluxe edition arrived at the World Center, and names were put into that same hat. Lo and behold, my name was pulled out. Even though the number was somewhere in the 1400s, I was ecstatic. But the story doesn't end there. That left-hand hall in the master's house also leads to a room where Rúḥíyyih Khánum stored her travel artifacts. It was used as her personal museum. Seated on a small stool in that little room, I was cleaning a Japanese sword when I heard her voice from the staircase outside the hall leading to her private quarters. "Marianne, did I give you a copy of the Priceless Pearl?" "I have one, Khánum." "Marianne, did I give you a copy?" "I have one, Rúḥíyyih Khánum." "Marianne, did I give you a copy?" I got the message and said, "No, Khánum, you didn't." That day, I left the master's house with a copy of the Priceless Pearl, not the deluxe one, but with more than her signature. The original, The Priceless Pearl, was published with the date of 1969. And the writing itself, without the index and notes, is 451 pages. Undoubtedly, Amatu'l-Bahá Rúḥíyyih Khánum saw another generation of believers that needed to appreciate the history of the guardian of their faith. Thus, there appeared in 1988, shy of 20 years later, The Guardian of the Baha'i Faith. That is a book. She gave it the same name as the article in the World Volume. On one of the front pages, she wrote, "This book is dedicated with tender affection to the youth who deserve to know what Shoghi Effendi was like and what he has given us for future generations." What is not in the edition of the Priceless Pearl that is in The Guardian of the Baha'i Faith, the book, are 24 more photographs. In writing The Priceless Pearl, Rúḥíyyih Khánum had the audiovisual department make numerous copies of the photographs that would appear in the book. Years after the publication, those extra copies were still around and had to be stored somewhere. As she sat in the mandar room of the master's house, surrounded by boxes of the photographs and some on her lap, Violette, Nell, and I were standing around looking at the photos with coveted eyes. Noticing our expectations, she said, "Okay," and gave us some copies. My two are now above my head on the wall. One is of Shoghi Effendi as a young man before he went to Oxford, which appears in the Priceless Pearl. It also appears in the Guardian of the Baha'i Faith. The other one does not appear in the Priceless Pearl. She did, however, put it in the Guardian of the Baha'i Faith. It is a beautiful drawing of just the head of Shoghi Effendi when he was maybe 1 year old. It was made from the photo that appears in the front page of the Priceless Pearl. Friends, we will be spending the next 3 Tuesdays speaking directly on the life and work of Shoghi Effendi as chronicled in the Priceless Pearl. The history is beyond valuable. Whenever I need some particular fact in respect of the faith in the 20th century, I often turn to God Passes By, Shoghi Effendi's masterpiece on the first 100 years of the faith, and the Priceless Pearl. Dwelling on the author again, 2 volumes of a 2011 publication are recommended for reading. The Maxwells of Montreal, Volume 1, Early Years 1870 to 1922, and Volume 2, Middle Years 1923 to 1937, and Late Years 1937 to 1952. Briefly, their history. When Mary Maxwell was 17 years old, she promised her mother, May Bowles Maxwell, one of the very early Western believers and much loved by Abdu'l-Bahá, that she would write a book on her life. You can read of this in the introduction. For decades, Mary Maxwell and later Amatu'l-Bahá Khánum collected thousands of papers for the major undertaking. In the 1980s, she had Violette and Nell with herself, looking and sorting through those 6,000 papers. I was given all of the family photographs, particularly her father's photographs, which included hundreds of glass negatives to be matched to the picture. I had to sort, organize, and copy any information written on the backs of the photographs. Rúḥíyyih Khánum would on occasion drop into the little room that I worked in behind the main house of the master's house. She would look at one of the family pictures and tell me some story about the person or the occasion. Eventually, year after year, her services and responsibilities, and then aging, prevented Rúḥíyyih Khánum from writing the volumes herself. They are published under Violette Nachavani's name. Now, friends, I must confess that those privileged to be often in the presence of Amatu'l-Bahá Rúḥíyyih Khánum might somehow think that they had a good idea of her specialness. Reading the Maxwells of Montreal corrected our misconception. She is one of the uniquenesses of this latest faith of the Creator God. Discover this for yourself in the reading. In closing this first session, One more book must be mentioned, published in 1996, 4 years before her death in Haifa, Poems of the Passing. It brings us back to the period following the ascension of Shoghi Effendi. Except for the last 2 poems, those poems were written between 1957 and 1959, when her heart was aching terribly from her personal loss. I'd like to refer to just one of the poems because in retrospect, it seems connected to the Priceless Pearl. It appears on pages 19 and 20 of Poems of the Passing, a 7-stanza poem she titled Lofty Mansions, written 13 December 1957. Only the first and last 2 stanzas will be read. For me, the first stanza is of her pain, and the last ones Shoghi Effendi's sacrifices and their cost. The first. They say your storied love should now be written down. Who could ever read it? Ere long the first page was done, tears would eclipse the dancing words, and any proper heart or mind would rebel against the pain. The last 2 stanzas. You lighted up the lamps, made wide the halls for men, spread out the costly rugs, and marked the way. So let it be. The building blocks were tears, heart's blood the lime that held each stone. The trowel you used was pain. But let it be covered deep in your memory, in my memory. Let men have their dream palace. They need not know its price. During the month of October 1958, nearly 1 year after the Guardian's passing, Rúḥíyyih Khánum was back in London to supervise the erection and completion of the sepulchre. The text of the inscription on the column is taken from the will and testament of Amatu'l-Bahá. When you visit the Guardian's grave, you will read, Shoghi Effendi, 3 March 1986 to 4 November 1957. Quoted, behold, he is the blessed and sacred bough that has branched out from the twin holy trees. Well is it with him that seeketh the shelter of his shade that shadoweth all mankind. Amatu'l-Bahá. Thank you, friends.
Thank you so much, Marianne. That was lovely. I do have a few comments. Let's see, Lena, do you want to go ahead and ask? And then if anybody else has any questions or comments, please use the raise your hand. We have a few minutes.
I just would like the reference. I wasn't quick enough to write it down about the article on the sufferings of Baha'u'llah. Please, Marianne.
Yes, that's a very good one. I have found out that you can get it online. It takes me a while to go through my papers when I put them backwards.
Yeah, or we could probably email that to you too, Lena.
That's fine, no problem, no hurry. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Of course, of course.
Any other comments? I did such a complete job.
You did. Here's Dwayne. Dwayne, go ahead and ask your question. Dwayne, please unmute yourself. Dwayne, please unmute yourself.
You keep saying the host muted me.
No, you're good.
Okay, well, what was the title of those volumes about the Maxwells? Maxwells of Montreal, was that it?
It's called the Maxwells of Montreal. It's 2 volumes. It was very expensive when it first came out, but they're more reasonable. I think you can even get them from Amazon. You know, she wanted to do 3 volumes. And of course, Violette and Nell probably wanted to do the 3rd volume also, because it ended in 1952. There were 3 more years of the Guardian's life, 5 more years of the Guardian's life. And she didn't die till 2000, not 20,000, 2000. So there's the rest of her life that needs to be in volume 3. I guess it is for future writers and chronicle geniuses who can put together the rest of her life. She always made it a point to keep historic records. I think I mentioned to you one time that we watched her throw things in a box and mark it a particular year. And she explained that this was all she could do to record for the future what her particular life and surroundings and the handswork was all about for that year. I conceitedly was pleased to see on her calendar that one of the dates said lunch at Mary Ann's house. So I go down in history, very minor.
Christy, please unmute yourself.
I went on pilgrimage in 2017, and I was privileged to read her book of poems, to her lament, her sorrow, and her description of his being in his shroud and her laying flowers. It was unbelievably moving. And what amazed me too was this was in December and January and February after he died, but you could tell from her writings that she was moving very quickly to accept the responsibility laid on her shoulders and to keep things moving fast in the faith and moving forward.
Wow.
But
I may be wrong, but I can't imagine anybody else in the world that could have been the helpmate that the guardian of the Baha'i faith needed. And you know, that book wasn't published until 1996. Like I said, just 4 years before she passed away. Because for all those years, it was a private collection of her feelings and her thoughts.
Yes, she laid it out.
Yes.
She was totally open, transparent in her grief. But also staying steadfast in her faith and in her duty to carry out the work of the faith that came through so quickly. She didn't allow herself to sit on the sidelines and pity herself.
She said the only reason she really wanted to continue living, which of course she sincerely wanted in serving the cause, but the main reason she said was what would happen to the Guardian's lifelong work if she wasn't there to assist with carrying it forward with the believers all over the world, and particularly with the hands of the cause of God.
Thank you, Christy. Roberto, please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Neda. And thank you so much, dear Marianne. That was so heartwarming and so what a bounty to share your experiences with us. I really appreciated that. You reminded me I had an incredible bounty of meeting Khánum when she was here in Argentina in '89 for the May Maxwell conference.
Yes. Were you
And-
there when May Maxwell passed away?
No, we came later. We came in the '88, so just like a year before the conference. So that was, she passed 50 years before that.
Yeah,
It
she
was a
did.
50-year anniversary. Yeah, but it was nice because I think because I had a car and I spoke English, I was actually her driver to go to take her from the hotel to the conference.
I can tell you
But-
that I had a car in Haifa for only 2 months. And during that 2 months, Rúḥíyyih Khánum was told that it was her car also. So she had me sometimes take her shopping. And one time she was invited to Caesarea for an opera. One of the Baha'is had a leading role. And she said, I want you to drive myself and Violette and Nell to this opera in the amphitheater in Caesarea. And when I approached the parking lot, there were all kinds of big signs that said, no parking permitted, no parking permitted. And she was saying, move the car, Marianne, move the car, Marianne. And my foot was going on and off the brake and the gas pedal. Marianne, take me to the door. I was confused between respecting her station. She should be delivered directly to the door, and looking at all these signs that said no parking. I
That- you know,
quickly learned that she came first. She was a dignitary. She could be driven exactly up to the gate. And of course,
that
then we
remind-
then we were invited to the cast party. And I was in the same room, if you know Zubin Mehta, the famous,
Wow.
he was the orchestra leader for the, I tell you, there's so many memories that I'm blessed with the memories, let alone actually doing what the memories report.
That's wonderful. I wanted to ask you, she gave me a book, which I lost in the move when we moved back to the US, but it was, I think, a condensed version of the Priceless Pearl. There was such a thing, right? A shorter version.
Actually, this, the Guardian of the Baha'i Faith is a shorter version.
Okay, that's what it was. Yeah,
Yeah, the one
Okay.
she dedicated to the Baha'i youth.
yeah. Thank you so much, Marianne. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah,
I'm
thank
glad
you,
you came.
Roberto. Yeah. Let's see. Brian, please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hello, my
Miss
Chinese
Marian.
friend.
Hello. Thank you so much for setting a great example for the youth and the younger folks around. Serving forever and ever and telling these wonderful stories. And I have a question. I'm wondering, when you were doing all the proofing and reading the book before it was published, was there anything that you felt like, wow, I never knew this before. I've really learned something spiritually insightful here, or anything that surprised you?
Well, it leads to another story that precedes my entry into the World Center. It was 1966, and I was a pilgrim when only 20 pilgrims could come from the whole world, 10 from the East and 10 from the West. The 10 from the West were to take a taxi to the master's house and have tea with Rúḥíyyih Khánum. The taxi driver didn't know where the house was, so we lost a lot of time. Rúḥíyyih Khánum was so pleased that we finally made it safely, that instead of serving us tea, she served us Turkish coffee, which most Americans had no palate for. In the course of her sharing things with us, Rúḥíyyih Khánum, being an American herself, spoke very strongly about what was expected of the American Baha'is in service to their cause. To which Marianne, in all her ignorance, a Baha'i of 5 years piped up and said, well, Rúḥíyyih Khánum, somebody should tell the American Baha'is what they should do. To which she said, what do you think the Guardian did for 30 years? Of course, I didn't know what the Guardian did for 30 years. I was a new Baha'i who just served tea and served on the assembly and did office work for the World Center. Yes, almost the entire book was a surprise for me. And I have been living with the knowledge, so grateful to Rúḥíyyih Khánum.